Welcome, everybody. It's really exciting to have everyone here at our Spring 2022 University Scholars Series. We're going to have an outstanding presentation today from our colleague in the Department of History, Dr. Alberto García Maldonado. Before we get into that and some of the details about the talk, I want to first begin today with our land acknowledgement.
While we gather at San Jose State University, we are gathered on the ethno-historic tribal territory of Tiatmen Ohlone, who were direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and who were missionized into Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores, the lands on which San Jose State University is established and continues to be of significance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone constructed and maintained the 3 Bay Area missions. Our campus extends to surrounding areas that held Tupentaka Traditional Roadhouse, which were once located at the historic Lope Ñigo Nangran Rancho Pozolmi y Positas de las Animas, Little Wells of Souls, and also Marcelo, Pio, and Cristobal's land grant Rancho Ulistac, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. San Jose State University also desires to honor the military service of the Muwekma men and women who have honorably served overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United Armed Forces today. While we gather.
So just a couple of quick announcements before we get into the programming. Live captioning isn't enabled and you can use that. And we are recording the webinar so that we have it available to those who might not be able to make it today. If you have any questions, you can populate those in the Q&A. Don't use the chat function. I'll be monitoring the Q&A area and helping to moderate questions after Alberto is done with his talk. Of course, we have to thank all the contributors that make this possible. Obviously, all the work that comes out of the Office of the Provost, but as well as the King Library, the Spartan Bookstore, and the Division of Research and Innovation, along with the Department of History. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. I am incredibly excited to hear this talk today. For those who don't know Alberto, well, he is a faculty member and assistant professor in the Department of History. He's worked at a few other institutions lecturing before he joined us in 2018. He received his PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley in that year. And we were talking earlier, he's very close to the publication of a now 10-year project titled Abandoning Their Beloved Land, the Politics of Bracero Migration in Central Mexico, which is under contract at the University of California Press and obviously intimately tied into this talk today. He's had a number of conference presentations and he's held fellowships and other sorts of things at places such as Berkeley, as well as doing a research fellowship at the University of Texas, Austin from 17 to 18. He also teaches some amazing classes, including colonial Latin America, advanced topics in Latin American history here, and a number of other courses on foreign relations and immigration. So it's with that I'm incredibly excited to turn over to our speaker today, Alberto Garcia, to talk about faith, conflict, and bracero migration in Mexico's greater Bajío. Alberto.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Vin, for the kind introduction. Thank you, of course, to the Provost Office and the Risk Advisory Council and the library for inviting me to speak with all of you today. Within the Risk Advisory Council, I do want to give a spotlight to Cami Johnson, Associate Dean of Research in the College of Social Sciences, who has been a steadfast source of support for me and this research project. And also I want to give special thanks to Mariah Ramser, Justin Vienna, Leslie Seacrest, Melanie Schlitzkis. I apologize if I mispronounced any of your names for doing a lot of the logistical work and publicizing this talk today. And also thanks to all of you who are joining us virtually, or taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. Obviously, there's a part of me that wishes that we could be having this discussion in person, but obviously, the ongoing pandemic means that we're meeting virtually. So you're going to be able to see my PowerPoint slides now. So if we were meeting in person, if we were all gathered in person, this would be the moment where I would ask for a show of hands, how many of you in the audience had heard about the Bracero program before? I'm obviously not going to do that because I can't see the virtual hands, but in my experience, and again, this is obviously in the context of somebody who has spent their entire professional academic career in the states of California and Texas, usually a good number of hands, if not the majority of the hands in the audience, go up. But for those of you who maybe have never heard about the Bracero program or unfamiliar with it, perhaps you need your memories refreshed. The Bracero program is the name that's given to a bilateral Mexico-US initiative. Between 1942 and through the end and 1964, there was a formal agreement in place between the Mexican and US governments. And this agreement allowed Mexican men, the program was only open to Mexican men, to work in the United States as seasonal contract farm workers. And so they would come with a contract that usually ranged from 3 to 9 months. And the name given to these seasonal guest workers was braceros. Braceros is an old Spanish word. It means somebody who works with their arms, their brazos. Brazo is the Spanish word for arm. So somebody who works with their arms. In Mexican Spanish up until 1942, it was just sort of this general term for manual labor. But since the Bracero program ended, in Mexican Spanish at least, the term bracero refers specifically to those who migrated as guest workers during this 22-year period. All told, a total of 4.65 million Bracero contracts were issued. Now, when you take into account those men who migrated as braceros more than once, because you weren't just limited to one contract, you could get multiple contracts, throughout the life of the program. There are many braceros who migrated some once, but there were some who migrated twice, others who migrated as many as 10 times during the life of the program. When you take into account repeat trips, it's estimated that 1 to 2 million men participated. So this was a significant seasonal migration pattern that was codified by this bilateral agreement. And the majority of the braceros worked in the states of California and Texas, particularly in the agricultural regions of those states. So the Sacramento and the San Joaquin Valleys, the Salinas Valley, the Imperial Valley in California, the Rio Grande Valley, the farmland in and around San Antonio in Texas. And there are many, not all, but there are many members of the Mexican origin community that lives in the US today. So these are Mexican immigrants, people born in the US of Mexican ancestry, who may identify as Mexican American or as Chicanx, who their roots in the United States date back to the Bracero program. Full disclosure, I'm one of them. One of the things that drew me to this as a research project is this gentleman right here, David Maldonado Mendoza. Was a former bracero. He worked in California. He worked in the San Joaquin Valley. He also worked in the wine country in Sonoma. This was during the 1950s. So if any of you have any vintage Sonoma country wines in your wine cellars, who knows, perhaps my grandfather helped harvest those grapes. But he was a former bracero, my maternal grandfather. As far as I can tell, he is the first person in my direct family tree to have spent time in the United States. And again, as I said, there are many members of the Mexican origin community in the United States who can say that, who say, well, the first person in my family to come to the US was my grandfather or my great uncle, and they came as braceros. And then after the Bracero program ended, it was the younger relatives, the younger acquaintances of braceros who moved to the US, because they knew that migrating to the US was an option because of their older relatives who were braceros. Now, I want to spend a few moments on the mechanics of the bracero selection process, how braceros were recruited, how braceros were chosen. And this will be important as we move on to the end of the presentation. So the way that it worked is that the US requested a bracero quota. So the US federal government would contact its counterparts in Mexico and say, we need X number of workers ready to cross the border into the United States on Y date. So then the Mexican federal government took that quota, took that X number of workers that had been requested, and they divided that among the individual state governments in Mexico. So A part of the quota goes to this state, B part of the quota goes to that state, C part of the quota goes to this state. Then state governments, they received their quota and they divided that quota among municipal governments. And in Mexico, a municipality is the equivalent of a county in the US. And in rural Mexico, local political power is concentrated not at the community level, but at the municipal level, again, which is the equivalent of the county level here in the United States. So federal government divides the quota among the states, state governments divide the quota among the municipalities, and then municipal officials, they were the ones who selected the individual braceros. So the ones who actually made the choice as to which interested rural workers would receive contracts were municipal officials. And then those who were chosen would go to contracting centers, and then they would go to the border, and then they would enter the United States. And the bracero contract essentially worked as a visa. Now, this decentralized selection process was a result of two things. When the Bracero program first began, the federal government attempted to centralize the selection process in Mexico City. It asked everyone who was interested in migrating as a bracero to travel to Mexico City, regardless of which state in Mexico they lived in, but it failed. There was a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of corruption at the federal contracting center that led to violence, and that so after 1943, the Mexican federal government said, nope, we're going to let the state governments handle it. And the state governments were afraid of overextending their administrative capacities. They were afraid that if they tried to centralize the recruitment process, or at least at the state level, that their contracting centers would suffer the same fate as the federal ones. So they said, let the municipalities handle it. So that, again, that's the mechanics of the bracero selection process. Oh, didn't mean to go back. Apologies for that. And this is the type of document that I worked with. Publicity broadsides like this would announce, the recruitment dates, the selection dates, where you needed to go if you wanted to find information on things of that nature. This one, this was from June of 1951. This one announced that the current contracting cycle had closed. And if you had any more questions, contact your municipal government, because they're the ones who have the answers. So, where were the braceros from? One of the interesting things that I found in my research, and actually this was something that was already known before I began my research, is that at least 44% of the braceros, so close to the majority, were from 5 states. The state of Aguascalientes, state of Guanajuato, the state of Jalisco, the state of Michoacán, which is where, full disclosure, that's where my family is originally from, and the state of Zacatecas. So these are 5 states. They're in central Mexico. So these states received at least 44% of all the contracts. But these states were only home to 1/5 of Mexico's total population. So combined, these states were home to 1/5 of Mexico's total population, and yet they're sending almost half of all the braceros to the United States. And this disproportionate sending pattern, it continued at least through the end of the 20th century. Because at the end of the 20th century, it was estimated that 43 44% of the Mexican immigrant population in the United States. So these were folks who were born in Mexico and then moved to the United States, were from these 5 states. And again, the federal government made the decision. And when I began researching federal documents, all the federal government said was, well, these are the states where there was the highest interest in migrating. So we just allotted a significant plurality of the contracts to these states. And so to give you an idea of where these states are, so the following slides are some maps. And so here's the map of Mexico. And so these states, they're within the red rectangle right here. So as you say, central Mexico, not particularly close to the border in either of these states. And here's a close-up shot of the state. So again, it's the states of Jalisco, Zacatecas, Aguascalientes, Guanajuato, and Michoacán. So in central Mexico, just to the west of the Valley of Mexico, which is where Mexico City is. Now, then digging deeper. So most of a plurality of the braceros are from these 5 states, but within these 5 states, you'll recall that I said that, okay, the federal government allocated contracts to the state governments allocated contracts to municipal governments. Within these 5 states, the governments there, and this varied from year to year, but they distributed either the majority or the plurality of their contract allocations to municipalities in the region that I call the Greater Bajío. And the Greater Bajío, that region is the contiguous land of southern Guanajuato, northern Michoacán, northeastern Jalisco, southwestern Aguascalientes, and southern Zacatecas. And so roughly speaking, you'll see this oval here. So roughly contiguous with this area here. So southern Zacatecas, southwestern Aguascalientes, northeastern Jalisco, southern Guanajuato, and the northern plains of Michoacán. So this is the region. These municipalities there received either the majority or the plurality of contracts within these states. And also within these states, this is usually where interest in migrating was highest. For example, there were some years in Guanajuato where more than 80% of the contract requests came from the southern part of the state. In Michoacán, it would be between 3/4, 75, and 80% of all of the contract requests were coming from that part of the state. So even within these states, there was this disproportionate demand level. Now, this region, the Greater Bajío, the contiguous lands of southern Zacatecas and southwestern Aguascalientes, northeastern Jalisco, southern Guanajuato, northern Michoacán. In the decades prior to the Bracero Program, this region was the cradle of conservative Catholic opposition to the Mexican revolutionary state. Mexico underwent a revolutionary process that began in 1910. You had a decade of intense infighting, essentially a civil war between initially that began between the revolutionaries and the sitting government at the time, and then a civil war between the revolutionary factions themselves. And in the 1920s and the 1930s is the period of revolutionary reconstruction, the Mexican state rebuilding itself after 10 years of conflict. The governments of the 1920s and the 1930s, they were not fans of the Catholic Church's cultural and social power, Mexico being a predominantly Catholic nation. And so they began pursuing official anti-clerical measures meant to reduce the number of active priests in Mexico, meant to reduce their participation in the political arena. The revolutionary governments also viewed land concentration as something that was holding back Mexico's progress as a nation. And so they launched initiatives to redistribute privately owned lands. This was a land redistribution system that would expropriate and redistribute privately owned lands, and the beneficiaries of the land would own use rights to the land but they would not own the land itself. The Mexican Revolutionary Agrarian Reform, the federal government retained de facto ownership of redistributed lands. This was seen as a mechanism to make sure that redistributed lands weren't immediately sold back or gobbled up by private landowners. The governments of revolutionary reconstruction also implemented what they called a socialist public education curriculum. And so a curriculum that in addition, and this was the K through 6 curriculum. So a curriculum that in addition to literacy and math, also taught a more Marxist interpretation of Mexican history, oppressed classes being, particularly rural classes being oppressed by landowners, taught about the redemptive value of land redistribution, the redemptive value of labor organization. Official anti-clericalism, the redistribution of privately owned lands, the socialist public education curriculum, it went over like a lead balloon in the greater Bajío. Mexico is a predominantly Catholic country, as I've already mentioned, but the greater Bajío, even within Mexico, has a reputation as a very, very Catholic, very traditionally Catholic region. For reasons that go beyond the scope of this talk, the Catholic Church's institutional strength in the greater Bajío was much stronger than it was in other regions of Mexico. And many who are from the greater Bajío, their conception of Mexican national identity is closely tied to being a good Catholic. So in other words, for many in the greater Bajío, not for all, but for many in the greater Bajío, being a good Catholic is a prerequisite to being a good Mexican. And a Catholic doctrine, social Catholicism. This is a doctrine that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century. Social Catholicism had a lot of currency in the greater Bajío. So you have this region where the church has a lot of institutional power, where many are very faithful, very supportive of the church. And then you have a doctrine, a very popular doctrine, and social Catholic doctrine. This is a doctrine that explicitly rejected the Marxist argument that class conflict was necessary to bring about social change. So social Catholics argued for cooperation among the classes. So if you believe in class cooperation, and now the federal government is putting in a curriculum that says Mexican history is a history of class struggle, there is redemptive value in labor organizations and in land redistribution, it's probably not going to sit well with. Social Catholic doctrine also championed the sanctity of private property. And so that clashed head on with the Revolutionary Agrarian Reform, which, as I explained, called for the redistribution of privately owned lands, but what was redistributed was use rights to those lands. The federal government would retain de facto ownership of redistributed lands. So the institutional strength of the church, the prevalence of social Catholic doctrine in the greater Bajío generated a very conservative Catholic opposition to the revolutionary state during the 1920s and the 1930s. And the most significant flashpoint of this opposition was the Cristero War, a conflict from 1926 that began in 1926, endured until 1929. This was a conservative Catholic rebellion against the federal government, whose goal was to topple the revolutionary state. There was Cristero activity throughout Mexico, but it was concentrated in the Bracero sending states, and particularly in the greater Bajío. 2/3 of the active Cristeros were from the principal Bracero sending states. So 2/3, and the number of active Cristeros varied between 50,000 and 100,000. But 2/3 of them were from the principal Bracero sending states. And what ultimately happened was that the federal government enlisted agrarista militias as auxiliaries. So an agrarista is somebody who supported the agrarian reform. Rural workers who supported the agrarian reform, land redistribution, rural workers who had formed their own militias to promote land redistribution, and who are then called upon as auxiliaries to take the fight to the cristeros, to the conservative Catholic partisans who had rebelled against the federal government. The war essentially ended in a stalemate, in 1929. Then moving into the 1930s, former cristeros began joining conservative Catholic opposition groups like the Unión Nacional Sinarquista, the National Synarchist Union. This was an organization that was established in 1937. By 1943, it had close to 400,000 members nationwide. 2/3 of them were from the states of Aguascalientes, Guanajuato, Jalisco, Michoacán, and Zacatecas. So again, you know, the strength of the conservative Catholic opposition endured in this region. And then, even though conservative Catholic partisans, they never tried to challenge the federal government in the same way that they did during the 1920s, but community level clashes between agraristas, members of these militias that supported land redistribution, and former cristeros, many of whom had joined the Sinarquista organization, they continued into the 1960s. You have reports from community officials as late as 1963, where they say that the factions who had been fighting each other since the 1920s have robbed our community of any semblance of peace, tranquility, or order. That's from 1963. And in that communique from community officials, this is from Michoacán, the community officials noted, these are the same people who have been fighting each other since the 1920s, and they're still fighting each other 40 years later. And I talked about the agrarista militias, the militias that supported land redistribution. This is my great-grandfather, Teófilo Fuentes Fajardo, who was a member of the agrarista militias in the state of Michoacán during the 1920s and the 1930s. So the big question that drove my research when I began it was, did the strength of the conservative Catholic opposition in the greater Bajío influence its development into a Bracero sending region? So in other words, is this just a simple correlation, or is there actually causation? Is there an actual link between the conservative Catholic opposition, the strength of the conservative Catholic opposition in this region of Mexico, and then its emergence and its consolidation into a migrant sending region during the middle decades of the 20th century? And again, that continued through the end of the 20th century. And what I found in the course of my research, that the answer is yes. These 5 states in the greater Bajío, their history, I mean, their relatively recent history as this significant source of migrants, of US-bound migrants, it's inextricably linked to their history as the bastion of conservative Catholic opposition to the revolutionary state. Because those endemic conflicts, those intra-community conflicts that began in the 1920s and were still going on in the 1960s, they led to landlessness. They led to unemployment. They led to underemployment. And it was those landless, unemployed, underemployed rural workers from this region of Mexico who requested bracero contracts. So again, you know, the federal government, they're just seeing this demand. The federal government has divorced itself from the selection process. They're not seeing the real reason why so many are interested in migrating. But when you dig in to the request, the written requests that rural workers from this region made, that rural workers from this region made, you see the links, you see the connections. And another thing that I found during the course of my research as well is that the strength of the conservative Catholic opposition in this region of Mexico also influenced the bracero selection process. So it wasn't just influencing individual decisions to migrate, it was also influencing how individual braceros were chosen. And remember, that was something that municipal officials were in charge of. So right now I mentioned the written contract request. It was requests like this. The fact that the Mexican government was actively involved in attempting to manage the migratory process, it produced a wealth of written contract requests like this that were usually sent to federal officials, state officials, local officials, folks detailing why they wanted to migrate. During the course of my research, I examined approximately 3,000 of these requests from the 5 states that I studied. This request was written in July of 1960, and I'm going to reference it in my next slide. So I want to end, to spend these last few minutes just going through some examples of how these conflicts influenced individual decisions to migrate, how these conflicts influenced the bracero selection process itself. And again, all of these examples are from the greater Bajío, the contiguous lands of southern Guanajuato, northern Michoacán, northeastern Jalisco, southwestern Aguascalientes, southern Zacatecas. So the first example that I will talk of is from the state of Guanajuato, from Presa del Aguacate, which is a community in the municipality of Pénjamo. Now, an agrarian reform community was established in Presa del Aguacate in 1936. But Pénjamo was a municipality where agraristas were supporters of the agrarian reform, beneficiaries of the agrarian reform. They wielded power in that municipality. They were the faction that had the strongest hand in that municipality. So you have these conflicts, continuing on into the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But in the municipality of Pénjamo and in Presa del Aguacate, it was usually the agraristas who instigated the conflicts. And usually they were initiating land invasions in an attempt to acquire more lands for their agrarian reform communities. These were often very bloody conflicts. In fact, one military officer describing the conflicts in Pénjamo in 1949 wrote that they all end in blood, death, and the destruction of entire families. So in Presa del Aguacate, even though an agrarian reform community there had been established there in 1936, the agraristas, the supporters of the agrarian reform there, launched a series of land invasions against their conservative Catholic rivals, against those lands that had not yet been expropriated. These land invasions began shortly after the agrarian reform community was established. They continued into the 1940s and the 1950s. And what ended up happening is that in this community, those whose lands had been invaded, they are the ones who begin requesting bracero contracts, who begin migrating as braceros. 2 victims of a land invasion in July of 1948 wrote in their request that the mutilation of our modest holdings has prompted us to consider abandoning our dearly beloved land to search for work as braceros in the United States. But again, all linked to the land invasion. It was linked to the land invasion, the loss of their lands, the continuing conflicts between these factions of Pénjamo in Presa del Aguacate, with the agraristas holding the upper hand. That's what pushed the victims of land invasions to begin migrating, or to begin consider migrating to the US as braceros. So that's one example. Another example is San Jose de Gracia, a rural community in the state of Jalisco, which is in the municipality of Tepatitlan. And the written contract request that I showed you in the last slide is from San Jose de Gracia. Now, in the municipality of Pénjamo, it was the agraristas who held the upper hand. In the municipality of Tepatitlan and in communities like San Jose de Gracia, it's the conservative Catholic landowners. Landowners who oppose land redistribution, not just because of their material interests as landowners, but because of their spiritual interests as devout Catholics who believed that the redistribution of private property was a violation of God's divine plan. So in San Jose de Gracia, the landowners organized their own militias, and they violently prevented the redistribution of any lands there. Usually the way that they did that is that the land redistribution process would begin with a census meeting. Those who were interested in acquiring redistributed lands would meet for a census. They would write their names down and then send that request, up the chain of officials. But whenever anything like that happened in San Jose de Gracia, the landowners would show up with their militias and they would violently break up the meeting. And this was a constant cycle in San Jose de Gracia during, the 1940s, the 1950s. Tepatitlan's municipal president, to be the equivalent of a county executive here in the United States, or a county commissioner, in 1950 requested military aid because of the numerous scandals and acts of bloodshed that regularly occur in San Jose de Gracia. But the conservative Catholic landowners in San Jose de Gracia won. There was never an agrarian reform community established there. In fact, in the municipality of Tepatitlan, from 1915, which is when the land redistribution process began in Mexico, through 1964, which is when the Bracero Program ended, there was only one agrarian reform community established in the entire municipality, in that rural jurisdiction. By contrast, in Pénjamo, the Guanajuato municipality that I just spoke of right now, during that same time period, 141 agrarian reform communities were established during that period. So the complete lack of agrarian reform communities in Tepatitlan and in communities like San Jose de Gracia, that shows the strength of the conservative Catholic opposition. So what ended up happening is that landless rural workers began migrating as braceros. Pedro Carmona Vera is the name of the bracero who wrote the request that I showed you in the previous slide. In that request, he migrated as a bracero. He began migrating as a bracero in the late 1940s, continued migrating as a bracero through the early 1960s. But he explained in that request and in interviews that he did for an oral history project that's run out of the Smithsonian, explained the reason I was migrating as a bracero is I was a landless day laborer. I was a landless day laborer. I usually could only find work 2 to 3 days per week. There was no hopes of me acquiring any lands in San Jose de Gracia that I could call my own. One of his neighbors, Antonio Nuño Gonzalez, who also migrated as a bracero during the 1950s and the 1960s, he explained that when he was a child and a young man growing up, the only time that his parents had access to lands in San Jose de Gracia was if they entered into sharecropping agreements with the local landowners. And those sharecropping agreements, they usually had to surrender a minimum of half of their maize harvest in payment for exchange for using the landowners' lands. So neither Carmona Vera nor Nuño Gonzalez, in none of their requests and none of their interviews, neither of them ever reveals what their stance on land redistribution was. But it ultimately didn't matter because no lands were being redistributed in San Jose de Gracia. So that limited their economic opportunities. So another case that I want to talk about, and this is the case of Changuitiro, Michoacán. This is in the municipality of Churincio. This is my family's hometown. So this is where my family is originally from. And there, what happened in Changuitiro is there was an agrarian reform community established there in 1936. But the former Cristeros refused to accept the redistributed lands because it went against their religious beliefs. Also, the local parish priest was threatened to excommunicate anyone who accepted redistributed lands. So the former Cristeros refused to accept the redistributed lands based on their religious beliefs. And then it was the people who began migrating from Changuitiro were the landless former Cristeros or the children of landless former Cristeros. So I showed the picture of my maternal grandfather. His father refused to join the agrarian reform community based on his deeply held Catholic beliefs. So my grandfather, in large part, was landless because his father had refused to accept lands because of his deeply held Catholic faith. In fact, my great-grandfather threatened to leave the community if an agrarian reform if any lands there were ever redistributed, but he eventually backed down from that threat, reportedly because my great-grandmother told him that she would not be leaving with him. But again, the legacy of the conflict influencing the demand for bracero contracts in my family's hometown. The last few things that I want to talk about, and I know that I only have a few minutes left, and actually this is a picture of my, or at least the lands surrounding my family's hometown. This is the view from behind my grandmother's house. And this is the last slide. And so I just want to touch upon how the strength of the conservative Catholic opposition influenced the bracero selection process. In the municipality of Puruándiro and Michoacán, so this is in the municipality, intra-community clashes there resumed during the 1940s. And what ended up happening is that the municipal government in 1945, they formed an alliance with the local Sinarquista chapter, the Sinarquistas, that conservative Catholic opposition group. So at least in this municipality, the municipal government formed a partnership, formed an alliance with the Sinarquistas. And during the 1940s, only active Sinarquistas were selected as braceros, to the dismay of everyone who was not a Sinarquista there. So there's that example. And then the final example is from the municipality of Irapuato, Guanajuato, where in the 1950s, the municipal government didn't form an alliance with the Sinarquistas, but did establish a quid pro quo agreement with them. The municipal government agreed to select Sinarquistas as braceros, and in exchange, the Sinarquistas would stop being overtly hostile to the municipal government, would stop being overtly hostile to their counterparts who supported land redistribution. This quid pro quo agreement also had an added benefit for the municipal government. The Sinarquista braceros were working in the United States during that year's presidential election in Mexico, which meant that they could not muck up the electoral process in any way, shape, or form. So that's it. So those were the examples that I wanted to talk about. And again, the last thing that I wanted to say is that, again, at least in this region of Mexico, the history of conservative Catholic opposition, the history of that deeply held piety influencing political beliefs, and the history of migration to the United States, inextricably linked. At least in this region of Mexico, my big argument is you cannot talk about one without talking about the other. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions. I'll go ahead and stop the screen share now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That was really quite fascinating. It just so much complexity packed into this very interesting kind of regional and global process. So we got a number of questions. One of the first ones to pop is about the conservative Catholic groups being dominant in the area and then influencing the migration. The question is whether or not there were internal conflicts between Catholic groups and whether there's any countervailing push from more progressive groups, either against the Bracero Program migrations or that also played some role in the history of these migrations.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. So at least in terms of how the Catholic Church viewed it, interestingly enough, the church hierarchy in Mexico, at least initially, they were not big fans of the Bracero program, but their concerns was they were worried that braceros would be exposed to Protestantism, and that they would expose to Protestantism, that this would allow Protestant missionaries to convert them to Protestantism and away from Catholicism. And there was also talk that, that they would be exposed to what they viewed as the American vices of drinking and gambling. Of course, never mind the fact that, there's consumption of alcohol and gambling in Mexico as well. The United States does not have a monopoly on that. And so, but that was the Catholic hierarchy, like the upper ranking levels of the hierarchy. On the ground level, at least like many parish priests eventually realized that they could solicit donations from braceros to renovate, parish churches and things of that nature. So at least within the church, that's where you see a lot of the divide. The upper levels of the clerical hierarchy being afraid about, the influence of Protestantism and vices. But at the lower level, parish priest, ground level, not that much opposition. Now, in terms of progressive opposition, or maybe more opposition from the left in the Bracero program, not so much from the church, but from more proponents of economic nationalism, and who viewed the Bracero program, who viewed cooperation with the U.S. as a betrayal of economic nationalism. And of course, not just the land redistribution process, but also in the 1930s, Mexico had nationalized its oil industry, an oil industry that was, dominated by the U.S. up until that point. And so this idea that, well, wait a minute, like we just declared our economic independence. That was what it was. The oil nationalization was portrayed as. So why are we now working with them on this and something where they can, take our laborers away from Mexico, to work in the fields of California and Texas when they could be working here?
Yeah, that's
I hope that
really
answers the question.
No, I think it does. I think it dives in, and I won't get into the irony of the Catholic Church thinking that, or Catholics thinking that private land is some innate right, because we don't have to push back into the enclosure movement to talk about that. But another question that came up was about the educational system and perhaps what impact it might have had on the program. Was there a mix of public and Catholic schooling, and did this have any impact in relation to some of the things you're seeing in the process?
Well, yes, at least, rural education in much of Mexico had been the domain of the church since the colonial period. You begin to see the construction of a public education system, a secular public education system, during the late 19th century. And this is in the context of 19th century liberalism, 19th century liberal anti-clericalism. But by the beginning of the 20th century, that public education infrastructure is still very, very light. It's perhaps the best adjective is it's skeletal. Like you can see it there, but it's nowhere near what the Catholic Church had. And so, now not only do you have this new curriculum, but you also have the governments of the 1920s and the 1930s investing more in public education, actually fleshing out that public education system. And now you have communities that had never had a schoolhouse or a school teacher suddenly getting them. So that, also, yes, it was partly, the curricular aspect of it as well, but there was also this idea that the federal government or the government is now intruding in something that has long been the domain of the church as well. And so different, and I think it would have been one thing, because there were many, Catholic parents who said, well, like, if it's just about reading and, reading, writing, math, that's fine. But, why are you telling my children that private property is wrong, or that, land redistribution is what's going to redeem, the Mexican nation, or, things of that nature. And so many school teachers on the ground, like, they actually made a deal with the parents. Like, okay, well, what if I don't teach, about, what if I just do reading and writing and math? Will you send them there? So, oh yeah, we'll send them then. And so, yes, it was partly that encroachment on something that had long been the Catholic Church's domain, but that socialist curriculum, which is what they called it, that was the official name, that sort of drove the opposition over the edge.
Thank you for that. So here's another really interesting question. How is the Bracero program, and how were the Braceros viewed by Mexicans that were already in the United States and their Mexican-American children? Was there conflict or pushback, as there was, for example, in the Great Migration, that happened of Black and African-Americans from the South to the North?
Yeah. Well, I think the title of a great book by David Gutierrez, who focuses on this, amply sums up what the Mexican community that was already in the US, how they reacted. And the title of the book is Walls and Mirrors. And so there were some of the established immigrant community and also the established Mexican-American community. The term Chicanx doesn't really emerge until the 1960s. But there were some who, saw this influx and said, okay, well, you know what, these are our, not literal brothers, but, these are our brothers who are coming over, like, we should do our best to welcome them, try to make sure that, that they're not the victims of discrimination, try to make sure that they are being paid what the growers are saying that they are paying them. but there are others who oppose the Bracero program, and many of them, partly there was a labor argument. The Braceros are, okay, the justification when the Bracero program began was they're replacing the young American men who are mobilizing to fight in World War II. But then the program continued after the war ended because farm owners in California and Texas, much like they do today, like having access to a low wage, immigrant workforce that, is discouraged from forming unions. So, they're taking jobs away that could be going to US born workers. They're depressing wages. They're being used as strike breakers, but also there were several civil rights organizations who at that time, they thought that assimilation into mainstream English speaking culture was what the Mexican immigrant and the Mexican American community needed to do. And so they thought that this influx of, Mexican immigrants, the majority of them Spanish speakers, but there were also indigenous braceros as well, or that came from indigenous communities. They thought that this is going to impact the goal of assimilation into mainstream English speaking culture. This is also, something that we need to push back against. So, it varied.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to do one last question because I think that's what we have time for. I want to let everybody know, though, as well, that the deadline's coming up for the SJSU annual author and artist celebration. I just put the link to the form in. So if you haven't had a chance yet to submit your material, do that. So I think probably with the time we have remaining, one more question that came up I'll just read it because it's probably easier to try to summarize it. I understand the wartime motivation of the United States government in setting up the Bracero program, but I'm interested how and if World War II played any role from the Mexican perspective in the first years of the program.
A big role. Mexico, along with Brazil, were the principal Latin American members of the Anti-Axis Alliance. And so in Mexico, when it began, this was promoted as, okay, this is Mexico's contribution to the war effort. We're an ally. This is our contribution to the war effort. Our braceros who are working in the fields of California and Texas, maybe they're not on the front lines. Maybe they're not mobilizing for the Pacific. They're not mobilizing for North Africa, or eventually the Europe or the Western European theater, but they are part of the fight for democracy as much as anyone else. And so this was definitely in the public justification on the Mexican side, very much a part of it as well, but very much in the idea that the braceros are their own kind of foot soldier in the fight for democracy. And this is Mexico's contribution. This is how Mexico is going to make sure that the Axis is defeated, by helping the United States in this way.
Awesome. Well, again, Alberto, thank you so much. And by the way, it makes me want to take one of your classes. It's just absolutely dynamic and engaging presentation today. And thank you for kicking off the series. For everybody else, as I noted, please get your author and artist celebration material in. The link is in the chat right now, so you can click it before you go. And check out the next couple of presentations that'll be coming up over the next couple of months. And everyone give a virtual round of applause to Alberto. Thank you.
Thank you all.